Hi guys, I'd like to introduce you to a mod called DYNAVISION for Fallout 4. This mod was created by my good eye and myself, and the basic aims of the mod are to provide dynamic depth of field for that atmospheric and cinematic experience without compromising gameplay. And that last part is actually very important, because whilst we wanted to improve the game's visuals, we didn't want it to come at the cost of gameplay. We didn't want it to interfere with things like fighting, looting, and all of the other important things that go along with games such as this. If you are not totally sure what dynamic depth of field is, I will attempt to show you using this sign. I do apologise in advance for the fact that it is extremely low resolution. I'm not actually using any visual mods beyond DYNAVISION at the moment. If you look in the background, you will see everything is out of focus. In fact, the only thing that is clearly in focus is the sign that we are looking at. This is depth of field. If I now look to my right at the sign in the background, it will come into focus and you can see it clearly. If I now look further to the right, off towards the clouds in the distance, you can also see that the sign we were looking at, the close one, is now blurred. It's as if we're focusing far in the distance and the near objects are slightly blurred. The mod also comes with an option to have a static depth of field. That is a depth of field effect that is applied to the distant terrain and does not change with the objects you are looking at. In fact, I'll just go into first person to show you that right now. This is the long range setting, and you can see off in the distance that the horizon is out of focus, but pretty much everything else, including these ships, is still fairly focused. This will not change. This is actually the default setting the mod starts as. You get into game the first time with this mod, and this is how it will behave. If you want to change that and have dynamic depth of field, you will need to go along to the mod settings, which you'll find in your inventory. It is a holotape called Mod Settings DYNAVISION, which you can load into your Pip-Boy and then change all the settings. If you go along to Activate, Deactivate, you get options to switch the mod off, something I recommend doing if you're going to uninstall the mod. For example, just switch it off, then save your game, and then leave and remove the mod. You can change to a different static depth of field, so for example a shorter one. If I set that, and you will now see the ships themselves have been blurred, but again it's still static, nothing will change. Or I can change to the dynamic depth of field. You've probably already noticed I can also change a few other things, including the blur strength. The mod starts at 0.8, at 80% maximum strength. You can change it up to about 110. 110 is about the limit the game will allow without getting some strange effects. I've set that to 110%. Now you can see the distant terrain has immediately cleared up because I'm looking at it, but if I get close to this tree, you will see it starts to blur, well, quite strongly because I've set it to 110%. Obviously, if that is too strong for you, you can change that, drop it down to, as 80% is the default, but let's drop it down to 70. This is quite a mild setting. So even when you are looking straight at an object here, you can still make out the details in the background. And if you get a little further away, it becomes a little clearer. This is an atmospheric setting, but it doesn't dominate. I mentioned earlier that one of the prime criteria for this mod was that it should not interfere with gameplay. And to help that along, what we've added are some settings to adjust the strength of the blur as you are playing. So for example, I've already shown you the main strength. This gives you how strong a blur you get most of the time. There is one for interiors as well, so if you want a different strength inside than you do outside, you can change it here. But you also have the combat and running multipliers. I'll show you the running one first of all. I'm going to set the main strength quite high to show you the effect. I'm going to set it at 110%, which is a very strong blur. This is going to make great screenshots, but it might make playing a little difficult. And then I'm going to change running to a multiplier of 1. What this means is the blur will stay the same no matter whether I'm running or not. So if I crouch now and look here, you can see the background is very blurred. And if I now run sideways, you notice it just doesn't change. Okay? Now that might be a problem. I mean, if you're running around trying to find things and you're looking at close objects, you might miss things in the distance. If you're worried about that, what you can do is go along to the running multiplier. Sorry, that's the focus speed, excuse me. Blur strength, running, and then I'm going to change it to say 0.7. And what this will do is it'll take whatever strength I've chosen and multiply it by 0.7, i.e. it will reduce it by 30%. And so now, when I move along the wall, you can probably see it's cleared up. And as soon as I stop, it blurs. I'll choose a higher setting so you can see the effect even more so. And I will change it to, let's just go all the way, 0.4. You can even turn it off, as you saw. So now, I get close, you can see it's very blurred in the background, and now I will move, and it immediately clears up because it's 40% of the normal blur. This only occurs when I run. If I walk, the effect will not be reduced. And I decided to do this because generally when you're walking, it's because you're trying to do something cool and you want the cool effect. Whereas when you're running around, you might be looking to loot things and you want the effect to, wind down a little bit. As you can see, it's wound down quite a lot. If I stop, you'll see immediately the background faded. And of course you can do the same for combat. You can reduce the value or even switch it off. So if you like the blurred effect but it really is distracting when in the middle of a firefight, just switch it off and it will disappear without any problems. You may also have noticed a focus speed setting. This will allow you to change how fast the focus is. So when you look away, how fast will the close object blur and how fast will it come into focus when you look back at it. Now, the setting starts off fairly mediocre. I think it's setting 2 by default. You can change it a little. However, there are some limits to this because of the game engine. I'll crank it up to number 4. So this is theoretically twice as fast. It just doesn't quite work that way. Because I wanted to keep this effect smooth, it's not exactly twice as fast. It's twice as fast in certain places, but at some other places I forced it to slow down so that the transition was smooth. This is a little faster. I can tell you it prioritizes focus. So when I look at this close object now, which is now blurred, it comes into focus very, very quickly. What goes out of focus occurs a little slower. This is important. If you're playing a game and you quickly look at something, you want the focus to happen pretty much as fast as possible. The blur in the background is less important, so that's the order it will happen in. You'll see it focus in and then the blur will occur. So if I now change it to the fastest setting I was comfortable with, 5. It is a little snappier, but it's never totally snappy, and this is a limitation of the game engine, I'm afraid. I can't actually demand that much from this engine. It refuses to give it to me. So there is another setting for those who like really abrupt changes, and that is harsh, no smoothing. And what that does is it immediately changes the focus the instant the mod detects a distant change. Again, the speed at which that happens completely depends on the game. I cannot control how fast the game responds and how fast it allows me to check this. So when I look, you can see it happen pretty quickly. It is fairly abrupt though. It's a fairly aggressive change, as you can see. So you will have to decide whether or not you like that. I actually prefer a slightly slower speed. I think I prefer about 3, but I also prefer a lower blur strength. I like the 0.8 setting and, sorry, the 80% setting, and I change the running value to 0.7 or 0.8, and I change combat to 0.6. I believe that's what I've defaulted it to. This means when I'm running around, the blur is actually quite, well, sedate. As you can see here, because the blur is less aggressive, the smoothing is easier, it is better. And of course, once I'm moving around, the effect becomes quite minimalistic. It's at probably about 50 or 60% total, and because I'm quite far away from whatever I'm looking at, there is only a slight blur in the background. You'll barely notice it, but as soon as I stop moving, it kicks in and becomes a little stronger. What you're going to have to do is play with the settings and see what works for you. Your system might actually be able to push this faster than mine. You might find it's sharper than it is for me, and you might want to drop the speed. You might enjoy really strong, hard depth of field, or you might just like a really faint effect. Perhaps you just want it to be, let's put it on 60%, the tiniest of blurs, so you get a slight haze, but nothing too strong. You could still run around looting, shooting, and barely notice this. It does, however, give the distance a little softness, something that makes it feel a little less harsh, and may hide some of the more unpleasant details you get in this game. And before I wrap this up, let me answer a question I know will be asked, and that is, what is the difference between this and, say, the depth of field from an ENB? And the simple answer is, this mod is a pure ESP based mod. It's a fairly standard mod that is just like 99% of the mods you will ever install. It's completely compatible with things like Bethesda.net, and just it basically uses the game's own engine, the game's own depth of field. It doesn't require its own DLLs, it doesn't require any third-party files outside of the data folder. Now this comes with some advantages and some disadvantages. The advantages are that, again, it is compatible with all the different ways of installing mods. It is a pure ESP based mod, so it's simple. It is also very, very low footprint. I have noticed 0% performance drop using this mod. That may differ machine to machine, but theoretically this is a very, very lightweight mod that shouldn't affect your system performance very much. The downside is that it is very much dependent on your system. If your system gives the mod a lot of resources, the mod will behave well, it will be smooth, and the effect will be nice. If your system is not, if it only rarely lets this mod take control, the effect may be a little slow and sluggish. For example, when focusing, it may take quite some time for it to focus if your system is under a lot of strain. This is one of the disadvantages. The advantage to things like ENBs is that you can get much higher quality blur as well. You can get things like true bokeh depth of field, but the disadvantage is the effect tends to be constant, i.e. you get one strength. With DYNAVISION you can control it so that the strength drops when you're in combat, when you're running, and so on. So there are trade-offs to both methods, and which you use is pretty much going to come down to you and whether or not your system can handle it, because of course ENB mods, they require a little higher end systems to run well, but again, once you've installed them, you know, it will demand the resources it needs from your computer, and even if you get a performance drop, the mod will behave as expected. With DYNAVISION, it won't put any strain on your system, but if your system is already under strain, it may not behave as nicely as, say, it does on mine. So, I hope that explained that. really the only way to find out is to test both an ENB and DYNAVISION and see which works best for you. In the end, for a lot of mods, that's the truth anyway. So, hopefully I've explained everything you need to know to get started with DYNAVISION, to give it a try, and I welcome any feedback that you have for me in the video down below, in the comments down below, or of course on the mod page. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the mod.
Got a doll baby, I love her so, nothing else like her anywhere you go.